With Khrushchev during the Cuban Missile Crisis, he pulled back. It was his decision to pull back that ended the crisis. Would Putin have pulled back? Would Putin have had the guts to admit publicly that he blew it, made a mistake, and pulled back, which is what Khrushchev did?
I really want to start with the book. It's based on your 4 years in Moscow as a Moscow bureau chief for CBS, starting out in the early 1960s. You were in your 20s, you spoke Russian. Just to get a sense of the environment in Moscow, let me ask you something that comes out of the book. Why did Nikita Khrushchev call you Peter the Great?
The, the wonderful opening story. It was in the July 4th party at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow, 1956. I was then an attaché at the U.S. Embassy, and I was one of 4 people at the embassy who spoke Russian. So, which is surprising because today everybody at the embassy speaks Russian. But in those days, there were 4 of us, and I was the kid on the block and sharpened people's pencils. And Ambassador Bolin needed me simply because of the language. Then Khrushchev arrived. For the first time, a Soviet leader arrives at a July 4th party. And he's there with Marshal Zhukov, great hero of World War II. And it was my responsibility as a former PFC in the United States Army to look after this marshal in the Soviet Army. And he and I got along just great because I drank water and he drank vodka. And after about 5 or 6 drinks, he introduced me to Khrushchev, who was, as some of you may remember, he was, about 5'6" in height and width. And he came over to me, I to him, and he looked up at me and he said, "How tall are you? Do you play basketball?" I said, "Yes, on basketball, and I'm 3 centimeters shorter than Peter the Great." I don't know why I used that answer, but anyway, I did. And he burst into laughter. And in any dictatorship, when the dictator laughs, everybody laughs. And from that moment on, whenever he would see me, and he wanted to get a message out to the Western world, he would sort of beckon. I would come over, always a handy CBS microphone, and he would sound off. And that he was doing it with Peter the Great made it easier for him and for me.
But what's interesting to me is, and I think it's so different from what it is today, the different Russia theme already arising. You were able to talk to him and you were able to engage with him. And I gather you could argue with him if he gave you the chance.
Well, that's right. He was an amazing personality, a very powerful communist, a person who believed in the best of Russia. He was a little bit, in an odd way, like Peter the Great. He was absorbed with things from the Western world. He knew that Russia was backward, and he wanted to learn from the West. And so he invited Western and particularly American journalists, sports people, scholars, lawyers, politicians to come and sort of look at my country, Russia. And he wanted to then go into the West and talk and learn from them. Warren, the interesting thing, I'm going to jump ahead now a bit, the interesting thing between Khrushchev and someone like Putin is that whereas both were absolutely passionately pro-Russian all the way, very powerful Russian nationalists, Putin has turned his back on the West. He doesn't want to have anything to do with the United States at this point. With President Trump in power now, we're not sure how he is going to manage. But up until this point, he's put a great deal of distance between Moscow and Washington. Khrushchev opened the door to Washington. From the moment that Kennedy took power, January 20th, 1961, from that point on, the 2 men were on a collision course in some of the darkest days of the Cold War, each one eager to advance his country's interests without, however, running the risk of a nuclear war. And that was the danger again with Khrushchev during the Cuban Missile Crisis. He pulled back. It was his decision to pull back that ended the crisis. I raise this as a question. Supposing Putin were in Khrushchev's position in October 1962, big question, would Putin have pulled back? Would Putin have had the guts to admit publicly that he blew it, made a mistake, and pulled back, which is what Khrushchev did? That was the remarkable thing about this communist leader. He had the guts, when pressed up against it, to do something that was remarkable.
Let me get some more background on that, because